Okay, well, let's get started. It's a few minutes after 3. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today. My name is Simon Workman with Prenatal-5 Fiscal Strategies. This is the first of a series of webinars on comprehensive fiscal strategies that we're going to be talking with you today. So our agenda for today, if we can go to the next slide, we are going to talk a little bit about who we have with us today and what we're going to be covering. The beginning of this series, the point of this series is really to walk through all the different elements of the comprehensive fiscal analysis and why you'd want to do it. So we're going to start with talking about what the problem is and what it is that we are going to be trying to address with this comprehensive fiscal analysis. And then we're going to talk about what we actually mean by this. What does it mean to have this comprehensive fiscal strategy? And we're excited to be joined by some friends from New York who are going to talk about New York's experience with this as our state spotlight today. And then we're going to talk about a new document we're going to share with you, a readiness assessment, to help you understand whether your state and community is ready to engage on this and what elements you need to have lined up to be making the most of the opportunity to work on comprehensive fiscal analysis. So we're really excited to have so many people with us today. We had a lot of interest in the webinars. We had over 370 people registered for the webinars, represented from 43 states in total, and the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, and also friends from the north up in Canada. So only a few states not represented, which I think is a great testament to the just interest in this topic and the interest in doing something to really support the Prenatal-5 system. You know, we have with us today policymakers, researchers, funders, data analysts, consultants, a whole range of different roles, and we're going to try and tailor the content so there's a little bit of something for everybody on this. You know, and also to be clear, the sectors that we're talking about, you know, we have people representing childcare, home visiting, early intervention, family supports, maternal and child health, Head Start, all across the board. I'm Simon Workman, as I said, from Prenatal-5 Fiscal Strategies, joined today by my colleague Gina Capito from Prenatal-5 Fiscal Strategies, as well as Maurice and Fleur, and a few other consultants helping us out, as well as Hope Lassane from New York, who Gina will introduce a little bit later. And just if you don't know about P5 Fiscal Strategies, we're an initiative that Gina and I created last year to really address a lot of the issues that we're going to be talking about today, really helping identify solutions around the broken fiscal governance structures within the Prenatal-5 system, and really helping to sort of move forward towards a comprehensive approach to address a lot of those issues. And so, you know, that's where a lot of this work is grounded in and where we're going to talk about today. Gina, did you have the poll results? Were you able to see those?
Yeah, so hopefully some folks are seeing it. I am sharing the poll results on the screen, but I'll just do it quickly verbally since it's a pretty brief poll. A small portion have done a comprehensive fiscal analysis. More have done elements, not necessarily the comprehensive approach. So about 54% of you that were able to fill in the poll have done elements, where only 18% would reflect that you've done a full comprehensive fiscal analysis. And then just no, none at all is about a third of the group, 29%. So not quite a third of the group. So thanks to folks that also put their answers in the chat. We saw some answers in the chat that have also done this work in their community. And you'll notice that we use state and community as well, because we're really seeing this work happening at both levels, and that's such an important driver for the change.
Great, thanks, Gina. So on the next slide, just a brief overview about the webinar series. As you saw from the registration email, let me just let the screen catch up. This is going to be a 6-part series. We're kicking off today with the introduction to comprehensive fiscal strategies. In 2 weeks' time, we are going to dig deeper into fiscal strategies part 1, which is going to be talking about mapping and modeling in specifically of the different sort of types of fiscal mapping, the different types of fiscal modeling or cost of quality modeling. Then on February 10th, 2 weeks later, we are going to be doing a second element of fiscal strategies, which is really looking at revenue generation to expand the pie, but also innovations within the current system to really make more efficient use of the current funding within the current system. So those two, because there's so much to talk about on fiscal, they're spread across those two webinars. Then we're going to talk in March about governance and shared leadership strategies. And then on March 17th, we'll kind of bring us all back together and bring all this all back together and look at all of these strategies with an equity frame. And then you may have noticed we emailed about a potential case study webinar, which we were going to hold in mid-February, but we're now going to hold as a 6th webinar on March 31st. Hopefully you saw the update on that earlier this week. And we're going to use that really as a chance to dig a bit deeper on some state case studies, but reflecting what we hear from you across the series of the webinars about where you want to dig deeper, whether that be on the fiscal side, whether it be on the governance side, on the equity side. So throughout this series, whether you're joining us for just one or for multiple, we do want to be collecting feedback from you about where you want to go deeper so we can really tailor that March 31st session to what you want. And in terms of thinking about that, this is built as a series, but it is built so that you can dig into whichever ones you want to dig into. So if you're most interested in governance, you can, and you've done a lot of the fiscal piece, you could just jump off and go and do the governance sessions on March 3rd. Similarly, if you have members of your team who are really interested in one aspect, you can have them sign up for one of them. A few different ways you can use this. We're going to be recording them, putting them on our website. So if you're not quite ready to dig into this now, into all of the deeper pieces after today, you could just save them and come in and use them kind of as modules, as learning modules later. You also might want to think about who else in your teams and in your states and communities needs to hear this content, and consider sharing the content with them, and then maybe convening a local or state or community-wide conversation about what you can do in this area and how you can use this to actually make progress in your state. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Gina, who is now going to talk us through the problem statement that we're trying to address. You're on mute, Gina.
This problem statement is by no means going to be new to you. All you missed was me saying welcome and good afternoon to everyone. While I was, of course, one a day, right? You have to be muted and have somebody tell you that you're muted at least one a day in our pandemic. The elements of the problem are something that I'm sure each of you has spent time on and continues to be part of worrying you and thinking about how we're meeting the needs of children and families. We know that we have the realities that we have capacities that fail to meet the demand. We have unstable funding. We have funding for some things, funding that doesn't stick around, funding that we don't know where it'll be next year. So we spend time working on trying to keep the funding. That's a significant problem when we think about limited resources to begin with, to how much of our time is spent on trying to ensure that funding is going to continue and seek more funding as needed. And then we have a historic disconnect between what it actually costs in the prenatal to 5 world, whether you're talking about childcare, home visiting, maternal and child health programming, what it costs to deliver those services to children and families, especially at the levels of quality and the level of intensity or scope in the term that we want to serve children and families, and the resources or the amount that gets paid. And that is consistent across the prenatal to 5 sector. It's also consistent across not just the direct services that we deliver to the children and families, but the systems and the infrastructure of supports that is in place to support the programs, the individuals, the professionals that are working with children and families. We have lots of different support structures and things around training, quality support, coaching, mentoring, and those also are historically underfunded, and a significant disconnect between what that sort of good quality work looks like and what it costs to maintain a system and have an infrastructure, and what we actually invest in that. So that in a nutshell is the overall kind of basis of the problem. We also have, as we really think about this and we think about the way that funding comes in, because the funding does come in such a siloed fashion across the full prenatal to 5 sector, we have then issues related to, and a problem that we need to address, that is how we've tried to approach the issue of underfunding and unstable funding has been disconnected and forced us, those siloed practices have forced us into approaches to address the issue that further reinforce some of those silos. And so we need to then be thinking about, when we're really focusing on the problem, understanding those complexities of the problem. We know that we have siloed funding streams. We know that we have a very complex system in order to try and piece together funding and cobble together programming that will meet the needs of children and families. And then the funding will actually cover the cost of that programming for children and families. You know, we know that those things are in place. What we also know is that because of the nature of the way things are funded, we're all pushed into solutions that are disconnected from one another or siloed in their approach. We are putting the kind of the problem of our non-system forces us to continue to function in that non-system fashion. And so we really need to be thinking about how we're fundamentally going to be going about this differently. And one of the things that we want to reinforce, and we want to sort of acknowledge and raise up, that there are lots of things that each of us have done at different times in our states or communities around trying to better understand the cost of childcare, or trying to map available funding sources to cover early learning, map available funding sources for family support programming. We sort of see that as the different graphics and tools that you see here on the slide. Those are all oftentimes singular focused solutions or answering certain questions. And that in and of itself, none of those alone are going to solve the whole issue. And they're only going to be looking at maybe one slice of the whole. And that too continues to kind of exacerbate that problem that we know that we have. And so one of the other things that we need to then be pushing ourselves to really be looking at this more as the system as a whole, and a solution that is based in thinking systemically. And so I'm going to share here one state example of how funding comes in for children and families, and how from the federal level to the state level and then to the administration at the state. And this is not necessarily a current slide. So for folks that I can identify what state it is, which you all can, if the font's not too small, you can figure out what state it is, or if you're from that state, which I am as well. This is not a statement of that this state somehow has it so broken. This is actually generally what every state has, whether or not you've done this exercise, and that's something that we encourage you to share in the chat, whether or not you've seen a graphic like this for your state or community, and whether you've worked with some of the complexities of what it means, and then thought about how systemically, how are you working on these issues. And so this really reinforces this idea that how things are funded is very complex. There are lots of different places that children from prenatal to the 5 period are accessing services. And so that really pushes on part of how we need to be addressing this problem, is that it's not to say that we can just do things really well for our education system or just do it really well for Department of Human Services. We need to think about the fact that we're not going to move families to only getting services in one of these columns, that families do cut across these different columns, they access services, and it pushes us to function at more of a system way and system approach in order to address how families have their needs met over the course of, particularly from that period of when they're pregnant and about to become a parent, in those first few years of parenting. And they're going to move in and out of these different sectors of our system. And we need to push for no longer a non-system and how we think about the needs for more funding, better coordinated funding, and programming that actually meets families' needs. That's where we need to focus our energies. And one of the other really critical reasons of that is, if you have a graphic like this in your state, one of the things that we did very early on in Illinois was to be very clear about what percentage of our most highest risk children and families was actually being served when you put all of this funding together. And it was at best maybe 5%. So it was a very, very small percentage. And so we need to acknowledge that that reinforces that all the programming, all the sectors need more money. The coordination and how we go about it and how we use a shared vision for increasing the funding is a really critical component. Otherwise, we are reinforcing that idea of that it's siloed approaches to trying to meet the needs. We're drowning each other out because we're all going and seeking more public investment in our given sector. And we're really just drowning each other's messages out because we don't have that shared vision and shared set of goals that we're trying to achieve for our children and families. And so that, as we move from thinking about the problem of funding sources that lack stability and then the broken non-system that we're functioning within, it pushes us to then thinking about the solution, and the solution being a comprehensive approach to your fiscal strategies work. And so, because again, going back to that idea that we're not going to push children and families to only live in one of these columns or one of these sectors, or to only have their needs met in one of these columns or one of these sectors, it really is incumbent upon us to ensure that we are using a comprehensive and system-based solution to approach the work. So with that, and I realize that Marie may have just just literally joined us in this moment, which one might say perfect timing, but also I feel a little bad. I'm going to turn it over to Marie St-Fleur, as Simon mentioned, one of our fellow colleagues and consultants in this work, to talk a little bit more about that comprehensive fiscal strategy and approach to the solution.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I think we're all going from Zoom to Zoom today. Glad all of you were able to join. When we're thinking about what is that comprehensive solution, I think we're encouraging everyone to think about who do you normally have at the table? I think you usually call them and you bring them forth and then you get to working. What we want to encourage you to do is to, no matter what space you fill, is to really think about who is not at the table. And so that we can bring them in, because they have to inform your comprehensive fiscal strategy. And so when I think about that, if you're at the state, you usually go ahead and look at the subject matter experts. So you bring your subject matter experts, you come to the table and you make some decisions about what your programming should be and what your programming should not be. And then you talk about how you're funding it. Sometimes what we don't do is then think about, well, what about the analysts who actually look at the fiscal part of this work? Whoever invites their ways and means analyst to the table. For every one of you, whatever the agency is that you work for, there is a ways and means, right? Or whoever is your budget analyst that actually looks at that work and then ends up making the decisions. How often do we bring them to the table in order to inform their thinking around this work? How are we being informed by, so that's one level of it from the systemic perspective. So I want you to think beyond the folks who are normally at the table. I want to ask you to just think about what conversations have you had with the beneficiaries of this work, the people at the end game, the people who are supposed to be receiving the services. How are they informing the way that you're thinking about this work? So I guess when we're looking for comprehensive, we're asking you to push out of your normal way of looking at the work and think about who you normally link arms with in order to accomplish the objective. Kids and families do not live in silos. So your funding silos should not be, when you're thinking about reimagining that comprehensive aspect, then they put the kid at the center. What do they need? And then who's not at the table when you're imagining what your fiscal strategy should be. And it may not be a bucket of dollars that is coming out of your own line of influence, but it might be the others who are around the table with you, and then begin to imagine how you do that differently. I'm walking in the middle of a conversation. I'm hoping that is helpful to you. So one, understand, take a look around who's not at the table, then figure out how you invite them in. And then honestly, don't be afraid of your budget people, because they actually need to be influenced as well. Because at the end of the day, oftentimes that's who's making the decision around, think of them more than just bean cutters, but bean counters, but actually are going to have impact on decisions that's going to impact the substantive work that you do and bring them onto the table. I don't know if that's helped, Gina.
Bean cutters may be more accurate, right?
Yeah.
It was just that image, a bean so small to begin with.
Yeah. So
that's generally what we're doing, right? We're very reactive.
So we want to stop that. So push it beyond, reimagine the work. Yeah, I love that move from reactive and protective. I think Robin has heard me say, untether yourselves from what you normally think the work ought to be, because you can't get to someplace else. And as difficult as it is, the tension is there, if you do not give yourself the freedom to imagine what it can be. Because what's happened is our system has been built, not really a system, it's just been a bunch of us piling things on top of we need this, and this legislative session does this legislation does something else. So let's think about, untether ourselves from the normal and really imagine what you need. and then let's work our way back. That's what we're encouraging people to do.
So that comprehensive approach then, to further reinforce what Marie is raising as an approach to moving on it, is pushing on this overarching strategy that is going to be thinking about how you increase investments, you better align current investments, and then also further develop or enhance the efficiency of and strengthen your funding and governance structures so that they are functioning more efficiently and really maximizing what you currently have and what your possibilities are. But the points that Marie makes around how important who you're engaged in these conversations with and how that's going to change the nature is one of those pieces of doing things in a more comprehensive way and doing business a little differently than maybe you have as you've approached this work previously. And we want to now introduce Hope Lassane from Raising New York, as Hope is going to share a little bit of New York's example. As Simon mentioned, we're doing state and community spotlights throughout this webinar series to kind of dig into and unpack some of the work. And the work in New York is a great example of having done other things like modeling and mapping and really having some understanding. And Hope will tell you a little bit more about some of the things around what actual costs are for elements of their services to young children and their families, but still acknowledging and really feeling compelled to step back and think about how are they driving from a place of what are the principles of what we're trying to achieve for children and families? How are we doing this across all of the services, not just doing it for childcare or home visiting or, pick your sector sort of, but really embodying some of those concepts that Marie was sharing with us to really push ourselves to something different than how we've been doing the work. And so even with some of those tools and some of the strategies in place that they had previously, they're still then moving into a space where they're going to be doing some more comprehensive work. So with that, I'm going to ask Hope to unmute herself and join us. And I'm going to start out and just ask her to share a little bit about kind of what got New York to where you are. And while the work is new, and New York is by no means saying that they've solved it all, they're engaging in a process. And by putting it into a strategic plan, they really have kind of garnered different engagement in the effort that they can share with us this afternoon.
Okay, I managed to unmute myself and you didn't have to tell me that I was on mute. Perfect. Thank you all. Good afternoon, everyone. It is such an honor to be able to chime in here. Thank you for putting the slide up in this really tremendous conversation. And Simon and Gina, if not for you, year one of Raising New York would not have been such a successful year one. So thank you so much for your support, both in the work, but also in the background. I know I've exchanged many text messages and emails with you all for support. And Marie, you took a lot of my bullets. So I'm so glad that you came on and spoke before me. So I want to just give you all a little background on Raising New York. For those of you who may not know, we have a wonderful website that we are constantly updating. And so please check it out, raisingnewyork.org. But I just want to give you a little context for the group of folks that came together, because the human capital, and I know Marie mentioned this about who are your thinkers, who are the folks that are around the table, was really step one in really rethinking, and I know we're using that word reimagining a lot now, but thinking how our system would work to advance all children, because we were pretty clear that it wasn't just a hunch, but that New York State was not meeting the needs of all families that had infants and toddlers, for sure. And so just a little bit of context and background on Raising New York. So I'm a senior advisor at the Education Trust New York. The Education Trust is a national organization, and I'm on the New York team, and we get to think really strategically about our little ones in New York State. And Raising New York launched a year and a half ago, and one of the true strengths of Raising New York has been the group of folks that are on our steering committee. And so the steering committee brings together business, civil rights champions, early childhood educators, parents, teachers, advocates, and there's such tremendous power and creativity sharing space with folks with different talents. I think we are not afraid to say that we may have historically been thinking in silos. We want to invite creative thinkers to the table who are coming from different perspectives, because it is when you bring all those perspectives together that you're able to rethink some of what's been ingrained in us, and we need to think differently and more innovatively now, specifically as we focus on historically marginalized families in New York State and Indigenous groups. And so I really just want to make sure that we emphasize the equity / civil rights focus of our work. And so Raising New York launched a coalition. The coalition has now grown to over 150 folks across the state. And one of our starting points was really thinking through, so we have 4 overarching priorities, but we really focused on the first one, which is expanding access to high quality, affordable childcare. What does that mean across New York State? What does that mean in New York City? And what does that mean in the Adirondack Mountains? What does that look like for families who have babies across the state? And what we saw were tremendous disparities, right? It wasn't the same across the board. And then we started thinking about, well, if this is our current reality, if it is so fragmented, if there is so much work to be done, are we all in the same starting place? Do we know what the current reality is? And so one of the tasks that Raising New York took on was, let's create a shared language. We are by no means the only coalition focused on young children in New York State. There are many champions who who are on this call even, who we have linked arms with and are standing with. And I think what we've said is, how do we unite our voices? And I want to emphasize that this is particularly important with fiscal governance. How do we come together and unite our voices to make sure that we are leveraging work that has been done in the past and thinking through what needs to be done now to promote a future that hasn't existed for our babies? And that was just an incredible place to start. And I just want to run through really quick what our 4 overarching priorities are, because you'll hear them weaved into the work that we've done around economic security and fiscal governance. So the first, as I mentioned, was expanding access to high quality and affordable childcare. The second was expanding access to health and developmental care. The third was helping parents become more financially secure. And the third, and I saw someone put this in the chat saying, we need data systems. And yes, I was like, yes, that person is on board. We need to think about systems alignment, right? How do we take the knowledge that we have, the existing talents that we have, and better align so that the burden doesn't exist on parents, on families, on those who have been historically marginalized and unheard, but the responsibility, right? And I think that getting federalism and some of the other barriers that have existed for families in the past to really shift so that families are empowered and have access to all that they need. And so as we dug into our current reality, I know I have listed here on the slide some of the disparities we found, right? And so I just want to level set. I don't want to create a disparaging picture of New York State. I love New York State. I'm raising my family in New York State. And Simon, I know you're here too, and we're glad you're here. One of the powerful things about New York State is our diversity, right? And that brings folks from all over the world to our state. It is why we want to make our communities a place where folks can continue to raise their families happily and securely. And one of the things we found was, as we dug deeper into the data and we looked very closely at the cost of high quality care, and keep in mind the group that's doing this looking, right? These are folks who are coming from many different backgrounds. What we found was we really need to think a little bit more about the workforce. And we know in New York State that workforce was predominantly women of color. We wanted to think about the cost of high quality care. And so what are options for parents and families in New York State that have children 0 to 3? Where are babies going? And what are those differences? And then we wanted to think about expansion. Where don't some of these options exist? And how do we get to a place where folks have more options? Because there's so much power and choice, and we want to make sure that parents and families are empowered. And so 2 findings that I've listed here, well, there's 3, but I'll sort of merge them into 2 for the sake of time. 2 distinct trends, 2 distinct disturbing trends that existed in New York State. And I know on a national scale, we're seeing a lot of this play out in national conversations for sure. But what we saw was an expansion in wealthy communities. So we saw infant toddler capacity was increasing in our most wealthy communities in New York State, while it was decreasing in low-income communities and middle-income communities, and even in some mid to high communities. And that really solidified for us that we were in crisis here. And keep in mind, the backdrop was we did this research before COVID. When we think about, this is where we were pre-COVID. COVID has just exacerbated, I should say, many of the gaps that persist in New York State. And so that was one of our findings. The second thing we found was that our current childcare subsidy rates are insufficient to cover the cost of quality childcare in centers and in family-based childcare. And we found that out through our work with Simon and Gina. So one of the first activities our coalition took on was, let's think about the true cost of quality care in New York State. And I wish I had a sense of how many hours we spent wrestling with that question from many different lenses, from thinking about the workforce, thinking about infrastructure, thinking about the business perspective, higher education, home visiting, access to prenatal care. So we knew that these were all factors, and we sat together and really wrestled with the New York State story. And what we found was that we really needed to bring this story that we had uncovered with the help of experts to our state leaders, right? So we weren't just going to sit with the story and discuss it amongst ourselves, but right, that is the power of coalition building, is that now we had expanded and built this coalition with other folks in New York State. We knew we needed to start telling that story, and not telling it from a deficit place, right? But saying, here's our normal, but here's what we see as possible. And so with that framing, we were able to bring that research, and we can go to the next slide. In the last few minutes, we were able to bring, thank you, Casey, in advance. We were able to bring that research to spaces where we knew champions were meeting, right? Where we knew the executive chamber, the Office of Children and Families, other advocates that were really leading innovative work were. And we shared that story, and that, there were a series of conversations. Some of those happened virtually, some of those happened in person. Again, where we brought our analysis to our state leaders and said, here's what we found. Let's make sure we're really zeroing in on the experience of historically marginalized groups in New York State who have chosen to have children and deserve access to high quality care. And I think when we were able to be crystal clear of the current reality and really name the systemic barriers that have historically prevented our children from accessing the quality care they deserve. And when I say access to quality care, I'm speaking about care that is representative of their languages, of their culture, care that empowers them, care that prepares them not only for kindergarten, but for lifelong success, right? We are talking about for the early childhood educators that are on the call, you know exactly what I'm describing because likely you have led it. For the parents that are on the call, you're leading it right now at home. But it is that care that we want everyone to have access to. And there was such importance in really telling that story bravely and boldly, but from a place of possibility. And so I encourage those folks that are doing this work at the state level now. There were many moments, I think, where we had so many tough conversations, so many points of tension where I think we really had to hash out some disturbing historical context that exists both in our state and nationally. But it brought us to a place of progress. For those of us that are in New York State, I know we just got over 3 days of our governor's State of the State address. And in day one, we heard his commitment to young children, to children and babies, to increasing subsidies. So there's promise on the horizon. There is hope on the horizon. And I applaud folks from our Raising New York coalition that really took on the telling of this story, but also were able to put aside sort of some of the silos or walls that had existed amongst groups and really vulnerably say, what is it that we need to do better? And I'm glad that we were there to respond and answer to that call. And so I can't say enough how important it is to do the legwork of building relationships with folks across the halls or virtually, because I think that enabled, those relationships were key when we needed to have difficult conversation and really think about the promise and possibility that we want to be reality for parents and young children across New York State. And so not enough time to dig into the meat and potatoes of our cost of care analysis. It was incredibly important. It is on our website. And so please feel free to take a look at that important work that our coalition led. And thank you, Gina. I think I'm at the 12-minute mark and I was supposed to stop at 10. So I will stop talking now.
Thanks, Hope. That's great. So, I think one of the really interesting things about what New York's done is that they really have done a lot of work over the time, but there's still much more work to do, right? Like you did a cost of quality analysis, like you've got some more money from the governor, good conversations from the governor, but there's still that need to say, okay, let's keep making sure we're working towards this shared vision, that we have this kind of strategy and a strategic plan to really focus on this. And so that's one of the things we want to sort of talk a little bit more about now. On the next slide, we have kind of tried to think about how do you conceptualize this idea of like, how are you moving forwards towards a comprehensive prenatal to 5 system, and what does this really like look like when you put it in an operational way? And so we developed this graphic last year, which is kind of a work in progress, and we're kind of using it as a way to sort of start to think about how we visualize this. And what you can see on the left-hand side here in these cogs is these are all the different analyses that you might be doing. So you've got your fiscal analysis, which could be fiscal mapping, revenue and expense modeling, cost modeling. You might be doing an analysis of what revenue options are available there for new revenue generation. You might be doing an equity analysis, taking a look at all of your funding streams and analyzing the equity implications of them. You might be doing a governance analysis, looking at, how are you governing early childhood programs? How are you governing the full prenatal to 5 system? All of those things are good and they need to happen. But what these cogs are trying to represent is the fact that they all are interrelated. So every time you kind of do something on one of the cogs, it has an impact on the other cogs, right? So, any decision you are making in response to your fiscal analysis, for instance, there's equity implications to that, about who is able to get the funding, who has access to that funding. If the funding is only for providers who are meeting high quality benchmarks, well, who is able to meet those high quality benchmarks because of historical reasons? Same with governance. If you're thinking about how are you getting more money to more providers? How is the governance structure you have got either promoting that or creating a barrier to that? And so the idea of this graphic is to really use it to think about, okay, you might be doing just one of these pieces, but think about it in this larger picture. And again, it also goes down to the as Hope was just saying, the importance of engaging stakeholders. So the orange kind of oil that is keeping these cogs going, or the grease that's keeping these cogs going, is stakeholder engagement. None of these analyses work on their own without having stakeholder engagement, without being really responsive to the needs of the state or the community, really putting the needs of the end user front and center. So really being intentional about thinking, do you have the voice of providers and all providers, right? Do you have the voice of the service users, of the families, really at the center of these conversations? And are you considering the system that you have and potential changes to the system from that end user perspective? And how do you make sure that's not burdensome, right? How are you making sure that engaging stakeholders is done in a way that meets them where they are and isn't just engaging those stakeholders who have the time and the means to engage in this? You really have to go to where they are and really think about the tables, who is at the tables, what tables are you at? Especially when you start thinking about revenue generation, it's really key to make sure that you are at those budget tables. As Marie said, that if the state is talking about legalizing marijuana and there's going to be taxes available for that, how are you making sure that early childhood prenatal to 5 strategies are at the center of those conversations to get some of those new monies that are out there? And so the idea is all of those analyses should work towards this comprehensive fiscal approach. And this comprehensive fiscal approach should be really grounded in all of those different elements that impact policy, that impact the programs, and impact the practice. So all of the recommendations that come out of the analysis, you should be thinking about them from what are the recommendations related to policy? What are the recommendations related to individual programs? And then the practice within those programs. And how is the interplay with all of those helping you advance to that purple box at the end, which is your vision, which is what you want for your prenatal to 5 system in your state. And, thinking about what is the impact on families, but also on children and providers, on businesses and on caregivers writ large, and making sure that everything you're doing is kind of aligned to that North Star. Even if right now you think you're just doing a cost of quality analysis to understand, maybe thinking about moving to setting rates by alternative methodology, well, that's fine if that's where the focus is right now. It's not to say you shouldn't do that, but keep that larger vision in your mind so that the decisions you're making and recommendations you're making are informed by those decisions. And that kind of goes to, one of the things we talk about a lot is a need to have a vision for your comprehensive system and to have that North Star that you are all agreed to. And so, here's an example of a kind of comprehensive vision that we developed with some stakeholder input. The idea that you could have a vision that is a prenatal to 5 system that meets the needs of every child and family, is supported by sufficient and stable funding streams, and provides maximum flexibility for families, efficient administration and infrastructure, and a minimum burden for program providers. This is a sort of vision that if you don't have in your state, it's something that you should really try and work towards so that you have that North Star of where people are going. And, it'd be great to think about, as you sit there today, do you think, does your state, does your community have a shared vision for its prenatal to 5 system? Is it a comprehensive vision or is it just narrow? Because really, as you think about this, the decisions that you're making are impacting all ages. They are, really needing an opportunity to leverage all the different sectors and all the different funding streams that are out there. And if you have this vision that is in a comprehensive way, it allows you to kind of go back to every recommendation, to every proposal that comes along and says, where does this help us advance our vision, or where does it fall short of advancing on that vision? And underlying that, we also advocate for having a set of principles that are sort of the operationalizing of that vision. And those of you who've seen us present, from Prenatal to 5 before, you'll have seen us talk about these shared principles on the screen that really are sort of saying, these are things that most people could probably agree with. There shouldn't be anything too controversial on here. But the idea is that if you can get all of the stakeholders to affirmatively agree upon this set of principles, that can really underpin all the efforts you're doing to improve your system and really be a touch point back to say, okay, is this in line with our principles? Is this advancing them, or is this a barrier to them? And again, maybe the universal pre-K is the initiative that is politically expedient in your state right now and that you can make movement on. Great, that's fine. Doesn't mean you shouldn't go for that, even though it's not meeting the principle of birth to 5. But there is a way to develop a universal pre-K system that does not do damage to the infant and toddler childcare area, right? So the way you would hold that principle there is say, if we've all agreed as a community of stakeholders that we are supporting the entirety of a child's experience preventing kindergarten, well, let's make sure the design of our universal pre-K initiative is in line with that principle and is not harming the infant and toddler childcare supply that's out there. And as you look through these, very much the first one is about, meeting all children's needs, but also being really clear about those who are furthest from opportunity and making sure that you're being intentional about reaching them. There's a couple of principles in here about providers and making sure providers are compensated and are able to grow and develop in their profession, thinking about a lot of the work that NAEYC has done around power to the profession for the early care and education professionals, but also the same in kind of all of those who work in the prenatal to 5 space. Using the public resources wisely and efficiently, making sure that within the current funding, it's being used in a clear way. But also, principle 5 here, which really kind of goes across all of these principles, is really acknowledging the embedded social inequities that exist right now and that have existed for a long time, honestly, and being really intentional about how you remediate that, right? And so being really clear that in order to remediate those long-standing inequities, you need to really be intentional about that, and just saying, okay, this is access for everybody doesn't necessarily meet those needs. So really being intentional about equity and how equity is impacted by all of the analysis that you are doing. And so as you look at these, one thing to think about is, do you think that your state could develop these types of principles? Are there things in here? Can you take these principles? You know, we have worked with states who have taken the vision and the principles that we just showed you and made modifications to them and kind of adopted a version of them. And, you know, every state and local community has their own context. So we encourage you to do that. We're not saying these are principles you must take, but it is about being clear about saying, you know, if you think back to that graphic of what is our vision at the end, what are the principles that we're going to hold clear to get to that vision? And so that all of the steps you're taking along the way, all of the different analyses we're going to talk about over the next few webinars are really underpinning and the recommendations are aligned with those recommendations, with those principles. So I know some people have been writing things in the chat, and that's great. You know, we'd love to hear about whether these principles are resonating with you. If there are ones that you really feel like, wow, that's a great principle, but and you know, we're really close to achieving that or have achieved that in our state or community, or there's one that's furthest away and where you really are saying, you know, that is the area we need more support on. We're really struggling with the equity conversation. We're really struggling with, you know, reaching all kids. We'd love to hear either in the chat or if anyone wants to come off chat and share, we're open to do that as well.
And so when I was just chatting with a few folks and even commenting on the fact that the meeting style allows that you guys can unmute yourselves, you know, and then mute too when you're doing other things in the background. But yes, I'll put the principles back up. Good question, Brandon. So you can take a look at them. Hard to reflect if you're not looking at them. And these are resources that are all available to you through both the Prenatal-5 Fiscal Strategies website, and then a tool I'm going to talk about here in a second has them embedded within it too for you to think about readiness and reflect a little bit on the content. Well,
I noticed that somebody had mentioned, sorry, Gina, about, you know, one state mentioned that they have a mission based on a strategic plan, but there's areas it could be stronger. You know, that's another thing to think about is, you know, between all the different initiatives that have happened, you know, in your states and communities over recent years, you have, maybe you have a PDG grant, maybe you have a Pritzker grant focused on infants and toddlers. You know, think about like, where have you got missions, where have you got strategic plans, where have you got visions that already exist that could be adapted, right? That you look at this and say, you know, that we are missing an area here. We need to be more intentional about including that in there. We need to be more intentional about including, you know, this element and this part of the table into there. You know, this doesn't have to be a starting from the ground up again. It can easily be a modification to things that you've already got so that you're kind of making a better path towards that ultimate goal you want to get to.
So let's talk a little bit in the last couple minutes that we have at this introductory level about some of that. How do you look at some of what you've done, think about maybe what next, and then begin to do some of that work to build upon it. So I'm gonna share, and we're gonna share in the chat actually a PDF file for you that is a readiness and exploration tool, something that can prompt you in a lot of different ways to sort of think about not just the principles and sort of where else you can go as a state and community in the work, but then also to help direct you to sort of where you should go and kind of what you're ready for and what are your immediate next steps. That's the design of this particular tool, because as we think about this work, then we think about just beginning to reflect on the principles, you may say, okay, I know we're not there at all, so what do we do next? And that's what we wanted to sort of support you in the beginning to think about, is what may be the immediate next steps that you determine to take as a state or community to begin working on the issue area. And some of the things that we've certainly laid out as a foundation you're going to hear throughout the series are some of these ideas of steps to move you to a comprehensive approach. And thanks to Hope for sort of demonstrating how critically important not only is the big picture thinking, but the relationships of the individuals that you're convening to the table and how you really allow time for those relationships to foster. So it's sometimes what your next steps are sort of putting a more, you know, formal pin on the fact that there needs to be strong, trusting relationships among those stakeholders to drive on a shared vision for fiscal strategies. And then the pretty significant changes that are going to need to come into how your system functions and how you do things to, and compared to how things have been done before. That takes some real trust and relationships to achieve that sort of work. So we share these steps because they are not necessarily all things that you do at once, right? And we acknowledge that. And like I said, we've kind of woven them throughout the work. And then what we've done with this particular tool then is break down some of the components of what you may need to engage in or be thinking about as a state into questions. There's even a couple places in there with charts where you can fill in some of the components for your state or community to really help you to think about readiness around engaging in comprehensive work, how you leverage what you've done before, where you can identify, okay, we did do a mapping process, but the mapping really focused on prenatal to 3 only, or it focused only on preschool age children, or only one sector of services. And so we need to do a more comprehensive fiscal map, just kind of point you in some of those directions, answer questions that help you think about what you have in place and then where you may take it to go next. And so what this slide just walks you through, and then I saw the PDF pop up in the chat, so you also have access to the tool, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording and all of the materials for everyone that's on the webinar, as well as everyone that registered. So all the resources are available to kind of all the pools. So if you know colleagues or team members that weren't able to join, they'll also have access to everything, is to really support you in this idea of thinking about what work is underway, who's driving that work, because that may change the nature of what it focuses on. And if you want to cast a wider net, you want to think about those not as usual suspects, or being more moving from that reactive state that, as Marie demonstrated, then we need to think about who else you need to invite and how you maybe need to share some of the leadership to drive the work in order to have those partners really feel like they're part of the collaborative work to change. And then how, as you really think about, so that's some sort of like what's currently going on in your state or community, and what do you have in play to work with? And then thinking about the nature of it. So is your work focused on systemic efforts? Are you thinking cross-sector? Are you thinking about more than just the sector maybe that you represent as an individual, and what does that look like? Do you have some of those system functions or components in place, not just the shared vision, principles, and plan, but your overall sort of system serving children from prenatal to 5 in your state? How is that currently functioning, and how are you aligning to that effort? Because you may be really eager to focus on increasing funding for programming for children and families, but you also need to really think about whether or not you have a system that's equipped to take in more dollars for services and do that in a way that's going to be efficient and get the services to the children in a quick fashion. There may be some kind of gaps in the system itself. I think we can all acknowledge that there's likely some gaps in the system itself. And then what the tool also does is lay out some of what your next steps may be, whether you're moving into more thinking and planning. How do we engage broader stakeholders? How do we engage in some of the mapping? And really starting you then thinking about putting yourself in where you are on these different steps, and then pushing you towards what that next action step may be. And so that just gives you a quick overview of what the assessment tool is. I know we're at the hour, so I'm just going to quickly advance us to talk about the next elements of the webinar series. So as I mentioned, everything is available and will be sent out to you as well, but you can follow that link there to get to the webinar series details as well. The next webinar is 2 weeks. It's January 27th, and we are going to be going deeper into some of the topical areas that we've introduced in this broader overview. And so we're going to be going deeper into fiscal mapping and fiscal modeling work, using a comprehensive frame to approach fiscal mapping and fiscal modeling. And we will have more state examples and state speakers and community speakers, as I think I saw a question in the chat regarding that. So we'll have more opportunity for that. And one of the other things that we had mentioned regarding the webinar series, as Simon mentioned at the beginning, is if there are other folks within your state or community that would benefit from this, please don't hesitate to share the webinar recording with them, and then think about engaging them, because there's the possibility of really working sort of as a team at your state or community level on some of the content that we're sharing and unpacking it more, and then really thinking about how you're going to use it, especially combined with the resource tools. And so we want to be able to support you all in doing that. So don't think that folks can't jump in even if they weren't able to participate in this first webinar. This is somewhat of a stage setter and resource share as well. Thank you all for spending time with us this afternoon, and we look forward to the rest of the series together. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.